Hi, I'm David Cassak from Windover Information, and I want to thank you and welcome you to this latest installment of the Stanford Biodesign programs from the Innovator's Workbench series. T.S. Eliot famously said, so this is how life ends, not with a bang, but with a whimper. Well, with apologies to T.S. Eliot, few people have gone out with a bang like Ronald Dollens, CEO of Guidant. Last December's announced acquisition of Guidant by Johnson & Johnson was by far unlike anything the medical device industry has ever seen. And just to put the deal into perspective, the $25 billion that Johnson & Johnson will pay is 25 times Guidant's valuation at its 1994 IPO and more than all the medical device M&A dollar volume for the years 2002, 2003, and 2004 put together. If Ron's colleagues and competitors needed any greater testimony to the impact that Ron has had and to the prominence that Guidant has achieved over the past 10 years, I can't imagine what it could be. In fact, it's hard to believe that Guidant's run has only been 10 years. Over that time, Ron has taken a handful of disparate businesses and managing through some turbulent times and through some dynamic markets, built one of the great medical device companies of all time. Ron, it's truly a pleasure to welcome you to our stage tonight.
Thank you, David.
So I know you're born in Indianapolis and that your first job out of graduate school was at Lilly. Why Lilly? Was it simply the obvious choice for smart kids in Indianapolis, or was there something that drew you to Lilly and the pharmaceutical industry?
Well, you know, when you're from a small town in Indiana and you've got a corporation such as Eli Lilly's presence there, you think that if you can get a job with them, no matter whether you're driving a truck or cleaning out the coal bins, that's a great place to be. So as I was an undergraduate, and then I found out that they only hired pharmacists in their sales organization, so I switched my major, and as my wife accuses me, instead of graduating a semester early, it took me about 3 more years. But anyway, it was more the image than any kind of logical thought.
So your first job was in the field, the sales territory. Well, any takeaways from that? What was that like, and how quickly did you realize that you didn't want to be a sales rep for the rest of your life?
Well, I was there for 3 years, 9 months, and 8 days. Now, anybody that knows with that kind of precision knew that wasn't what they're going to be doing for a living. But the takeaways probably were more of maturing than anything else. That you can't have that job without understanding that the people that you call on and all the people around them want to be treated as special individuals, no matter whether they're the receptionists or whether they're the nurse or whether it's the clinician. And as you go and you have that job, if you can develop those skills, it's going to serve you well.
Your first job at Lilly was editor of the Lilly Digest. Tell us what that was. And you told me that you thought it was a great experience. What was it that made it a great experience?
Well, you know, it's very interesting. What the Lilly Digest does is they do financial analysis of retail pharmacy. So retail pharmacists, whether they're chains or independents, would send in their income statements and balance sheets. And then you would go through and you would analyze those and give them suggestions about their operations. Now, here you are, some 25-year-old kid. I mean, what the heck do you know about retail pharmacy? But the nice part about the job is that you would go out and you would meet with these industry associations every weekend, because they only met on the weekends, because retail pharmacy, that's the only time you had off. And so you would stand up in front of them as the expert, and you would talk about different financial concepts, and if you saw this, here's what you ought to look at, somebody stealing from you here. But just to be able to be in front of groups and to be the expert and to be able to have that kind of practice with no one looking was just a huge advantage.
So you went from there to the economics study group, or did you go directly from that to the economics study group? And what was that? What was the economics study group all
about? It said, let's try to look and say, where's the growth going to come from the pharmaceutical business? So now we're in the 76, 77, 78 time frame. And the concept was we don't see any growth left in pharmaceuticals. I mean, we're kind of talking about national health schemes in the early 70s, and people hadn't really bought into any biological kind of revolution. So it said, Eli Lilly, we're very big into hospitals. What else goes on in hospitals? So as we looked at that and we said things like supplies, equipment, and devices, which is what the industry used to be called. And at the same time, we were saying we've got to find these other growth opportunities other than pharmaceuticals. Got a phone call from a company called IVAC in San Diego. Colgate was trying to buy them. They were looking for a white knight. And we're saying, hey, we're in hospitals. We must know something about that. So
now, IVAC wasn't IV pump company. Was the pharmaceutical connection of IV, implicit in IV pumps part of the appeal, or did Lilly simply want to get into the medical device business? What was the strategic rationale behind the device business buildup?
It was trying to look for growth in an area where you thought you brought some understanding. We thought we brought understanding of the hospital market. Lilly was big in injectable antibiotics. Yes, there's some rationalization, I guess, one could have in terms of IV pumps, electronic thermometers, but not much. It was on false pretense.
That was the first acquisition that Lilly did?
It was.
So talk about how, we all know that ACS was kind of the cornerstone, or at least was the best known. But I know that ACS came actually later in the process for Lilly. How were you building your device business through the late 70s and early 80s? And again, was there a driving rationale to it, or was it simply let's aggregate some medical device business and see what we have?
First, it was a random walk. Okay, the IVAC, and we did the same thing. Says, gee, and it was on a nice growth trend. You bought it at the right time. And then cardiac pacemakers, and it had about 1 year's worth of growth, and then started losing about $17 million a year. But I'll kind of get back to that. And we did physio control. And so then, essentially, I came out of the position, did a sales management thing in Los Angeles, and then came back in 1982. At that point in time, we had an individual running the medical device and diagnostics division named Bill Davis. And so Bill said, let's take a step back and put a strategy together. If we're going to be in medical technology, we ought to have a strategy, and really put together this cardiovascular thrust. And as we mapped that out, we talked about kind of a therapeutic orientation to cardiovasculars and where does that all reside. Already had this pacemaker business that was really going down the toilet on us. And so then we went out to the venture capital community, quite honestly, and it was Robertson Coleman's where we made the stop that they essentially said, hey, there's two interesting opportunities you may want to take a look at. One ends up being a company, Advanced Cardiovascular Systems, that are trying to do a sale leaseback on a manufacturing plant they're trying to do in Southern California, and that's that therapeutic catheter stuff. You may want to go talk to those guys. And then the other one is there's this Intech of MedRad Intech implantable defibrillator that is in Pittsburgh, and they're looking to do a couple of rounds of private financing. You may want to go talk to them. So. And which is kind of interesting. You think of that limited conversation and pursuing those two things, and that is essentially the essence of who Guidant is today. Was there a cardiovascular pharmaceutical business at Lilly at the time, or were they basically telling you to formulate your own device? It was really our own device. There was not. They've always wanted to have a cardiovascular franchise. Have never been able to build one, and so this really was trying to understand where's going to be the most interesting space around medical technology. Talk about the Intech MedRad deal. You mentioned to me that you sat down with one of the board members and started to talk about risk sharing, and one person said, not only am I willing to share the risk, I'm willing to let you have all of it. How did those early deals come about? Well, it was interesting because it was after we'd done the ACS deal, and we were so proud of ourselves in that the ACS deal was the first earn-out done in medical technology. And because the chairman of Eli Lilly Dickwood took the approach to say, listen, that you make an acquisition, you're going to be able to get the management team for at most 3 years. Then you need to be able to be prepared to run the business. And then he said, is there a way to try to encourage people to stay longer? And is there a way to be able to meet the owner's demands of the value of the company, but based on their performance? So it was the first earn-out put together, and it was done over a 5-year period, 4.5-year period, with 60% of the payout determined in years 4 and 5. And as David, as you're well aware, it's that takeoff period in the last few years that are the most important. So we did that, and the management team was so committed that they could deliver those results. They bought into the earn-out concept. And so we went down that path, and we were doing this in May of 84. So then we had already made 2 investments in the implantable defibrillator. So then we go out to meet with these guys at the Duquesne Club in Pittsburgh. So dark wood, it's the billiard tables down there and the cigar bar. It's really one of these old boys club thing. You're not even sure they still allow women in this place. It's really pretty unique. And so then we're sitting in one of these little rooms, and so I start this kind of with this little bit of hubris that, we've shown this ability to do risk sharing. We're into that. We'd like to talk to you about it. And as you said, David, the guy said, now this is an older guy that had sold rock stations and a coal mine, and I was obviously a kid. It's not only are we willing to share the risk, we're willing to give it all to you. So we put that transaction together and as kind of an upfront and a royalty fee. But
It's interesting. Two of your first several acquisitions were actually in cardiac rhythm management, and yet it seems as if, to an outside observer, it was the angioplasty business that took off most quickly. What was the appeal of angioplasty in the early 1980s? Because it wasn't as well established a field now. Were there any second thoughts about therapeutic catheters? Was there any thought that maybe this is a pig in a poke to be doing this?
Well, at the closing, we brought the chairman out. And so we had a couple of different places where we were, quote, manufacturing. And so went into the one place and they're blowing balloons with a hair dryer, and went into the other place and they were spraying these guide wires. And we're talking about, that this is sophisticated technology. And I could tell he was biting his lip to keep from laughing, So it wasn't obvious to everybody that this was going to be this kind of multi-billion-dollar opportunity.
It's interesting. I once interviewed, I know that you went out to ACS to be a senior vice president of sales and marketing and product development. I was once talking to Bob Reese about the early days at ACS, and he said, I like Ron, but we didn't need a marketer. I mean, we didn't need what were those early ACS days like?
Well, no, and he was right. But anyway, it was, and Bob's never, needed marketing anyway, and never saw any value in that. But that, that's okay too. It is, and it's interesting. I spoke about that in a little conference we had in San Diego not long ago. ACS is one of the companies that did not have to get acquired. They could have gone it alone. They had the strength of the management team to be able to go it alone. The technology had enough legs and enough iterations in front of it that could have happened. It just was a great organization that gave me the first insight that where you play is hugely important. To me, there are kind of four things that will dictate whether a business is going to be successful or not. First ends up being operational capabilities, and we can talk about those, whether it's product development, sales and marketing, managing the cost structure, quality systems, whatever. The second thing is the market structure. Are you in a marketplace that rewards doing things well? And this was a great place to be. And just kind of go on that list. Do you have sufficient growth opportunities in front of you? And then are there any environmental effects that even if you do all those other things great can cause it to be a disastrous outcome? And in our field, yes, there is one that's called health policy, but that's another subject matter.
Go ahead.
And so I think the space, the angioplasty space, the therapeutic catheter space, the interventional cardiologist, the referral patterns, the payment systems, all of that, the stars were lined up almost perfectly. And it's interesting how often we refer to whether we look at a new opportunity, whether it looks angioplasty-like or not.
So what were the challenges, though? I mean, it couldn't have been as easy as you're making it sound, because there were a lot of companies that stumbled and tripped up and didn't come out of that excellent opportunity.
There were a unique set of things. One is Bob was a fabulous, fabulous operations guy, put a great operations guy in terms of manufacturing, so that you didn't find out we had a manufacturing issue until they solved it. It makes you sleep easier, but then you wonder about what you're not knowing about. And you ended up with a marketing thrust, quite honestly, contrary to Bob's observation, and a sales organization that developed great relationships with the thought leaders. And so you were associated with the kinds of people that were taking the therapy to another level. And kind of those two things really, and then obviously product development, you were able to come up with a new iteration. If you think about all of the inventions that happened in angioplasty, 18,000 wire, 14,000 wire, things like the Hartzler Micro, just one concept, perfusion, rapid exchange, all those things evolved within the firm. And it's quite honestly, if you think of why J&J was interested in buying Guidant, had two pieces. One piece was, yes, they want to get into cardiac rhythm management, and they want to get into where that technology takes them into other places like neurostimulation. The second piece is that it has been a challenge for them to do the iterative process. It is something that got rooted very early on at ACS and is something that was able to continue, such that at any point in time, 60% of what you sell is product less than 12 months old.
And that's actually a very common feature of the device industry, but a lot less so the pharmaceutical industry. You also mentioned the appeal to thought leaders. Were you needing to relearn some of the rules that you had learned at Lilly in order to make the device businesses successful, or did it feel to you like a seamless transition?
No,
and was there any thought at Lilly that, well, this is a crazy business because it doesn't apply to the rules that we know work in this industry?
The time frames just are completely different. And it's about engineering. It wasn't about biology at the time. The biggest thing I had to learn is the definition of a three-piece suit was you had shoes on.
So you took over as CEO of ACS in 1987 from Bob Reese. And then in 1990, you came back into Lilly to head all of the medical device and diagnostics business. Give us a little bit of a piece, because obviously the ACS success was critical to the Guidance spinoff, which would come just a couple of years later. But what else was going on in the device buildup at that time? Because by the end, Lilly had 10 medical device companies. They
did. And they'd gotten into the diagnostic side of the business, and then they had continued to make acquisitions. And it was an interesting challenge from a career standpoint, because when I left ACS, I said, I'm going to leave the job that I'm going to get the most professional fulfillment from. And because you're able to stay close to the operations and then still do the strategy kind of things. And you're saying, well, why did you do that? Why did you move? And at first time, I declined to move. And the second time it was who I was afraid I was going to have to report to. So sometimes you take jobs for the wrong reasons, but anyway. And then came in, and we had a compilation of 10 companies, absolutely pretty much disjointed. And then got a new CEO, and which was obviously concerning because the old CEO held medical technology in incredibly high regard for a couple of interesting reasons. Because when he would come to visit, say ACS specifically, he would see that even as we built the new plant sites, it was all built for speed. It was all built for what can we do to speed up product development. I mean, the pharmaceutical business was stunned when we talked about we want to set up a facility in Basingstoke because we may be able to save us 3 months in terms of getting a product launched 3 months early. In the pharmaceutical business, who would chase 3 months? I mean, with the uncertainty and the risk around that. So that was a piece of it, and the other piece was the customer piece. That when they looked at medical technology, specifically ACS, they knew all of the customers intimately. That does not happen in the pharmaceutical business. Mm-hmm.
So you're talking about Vaughn Bryson, and the transition was to Randy Tobias. When did Randy come on, and how quickly and by what thought process did Lilly decide at that time to begin to divest its medical device business?
Well, they probably came to the conclusion in the first 5 minutes, but the thought process was one that was very legitimate. It said, if you're going to be in the business, what's the critical success factor? And in both pharmaceuticals and medical technology, it's new product flow, new product flow, new product flow. What determines your abilities on the pharmaceutical side ends up being biology and chemistry. What determines your abilities on med tech ended up being more engineering, software. And like I said, the time frames were completely different. We're chasing months, they're chasing years. And so Randy's conclusion was, we're a pharmaceutical company. If you can contribute to the success of us being a pharmaceutical company, we'll stay the course. If you can't, by definition, you're a distraction. And you're a management distraction, and if the shareholders are not being rewarded for us being in that business, we need to go through some process to cause that to happen. So that was the very legitimate kind of strategic rationale. The real, I think, story ends up being a more interesting one that says, as a buddy of mine once said, I told him we were in this process of trying to decide whether the medical technology business stayed within Lilly or not. He said, let me tell you a story, Ron. There was a guy in IBM, and every time he went to a new plant site, he repainted it. And he didn't repaint it because it needed to be painted. He repainted it because he wanted to let everybody know this is Charlie's place. He said, I'd be packing my bags if I were you. You guys are out of this thing. So.
Lilly at the same time was buying PCS, the huge pharmacy benefit management company. Did that factor into the decision of Lilly at all to divest Guidance?
It did not. Although it did kind of stimulate my thinking is we went to, because we were doing those exactly at the same time. And so being on Randy's management team, we went out to visit PCS. And you walk through this place, and it was like you could have been visiting a credit card company. I mean, this kind of phone banks, and you're saying, what does this have to do with being in the pharmaceutical business, and what is it we bring to the table? And it was very hard to see that, which kind of have led me to the thought process, we will never get into a business where we don't bring something to the table of value. Typically, that's going to be around the technology, or it's going to be around understanding the disease of the patient or the customer. If we can't do one of those two things, we're not going to play.
So we're now in 1994, and Guidance spins out with $1 billion valuation and a really very interesting financing that was a bit controversial at the time. Take us through that financing, and it eventually wound up creating a very sound platform for those folks who would be Guidance shareholders. Yeah. But it was quite a controversial financing at the time.
Well, it was novel, and I think it was brilliantly done from Lilly's perspective. We had been successful. I mean, we had built a business of this compilation of companies of $862 million. So, as I keep saying, it's like giving birth to a teenager. So, but it was a sizable business. We made about 8% net income as a percentage of sales, so it was profitable. And we had generated about $400 million on the balance sheet. So what Lilly did is they took that $400 million off the balance sheet, and they said, now we want you to go borrow $600 million. And so we went to New York, got a syndication of 26 banks, and we borrowed $600 million. And then they said, when we do the IPO, we're going to do a midnight dividend, and we're going to take that $600 million also, okay? So they will have $1 billion, and you will have nothing. And so I said, yeah, hell, it sounds fair to me.
Sign me up.
And we're then, when you do the IPO, we're going to sell off just less than 20% of the company, so we'll own 80%. And then after we let the stock season for 9 months, then we will offer the Lilly shareholders a chance to exchange their Lilly shares for Guidance shares in a ratio depending on what the stocks are trading for, so that there's a 12% premium to encourage people to trade in their shares. And that's exactly what we did. And it was interesting, 9 months later, then that was established, and the people around Indianapolis said, nobody's going to trade in Lilly shares. But it was interesting, you went to Boston, they're saying, for 12%, I'd trade in my mother-in-law, okay? And so, it was also interesting that the ARBs never took out the 12%. So that offer had to stay open 20 days. At the end of 20 days, the 12% was still there. It was oversubscribed 3 times. So those of us that tried to exchange all of our Lilly shares could only get a third of those back. So that was the transaction. So then as of September 1995, we were 100% publicly traded.
And interesting, you told me once that you thought at $1 billion, Guidance was actually undervalued at the time of the spinoff.
Absolutely. No, I was absolutely convinced that we'd have a $3 or $4 billion market cap, and it came out and it was $14.50, and with the number of shares out there, as you mentioned, it was $1 billion market cap.
You were intimately involved with Lilly's device business, as you said. Spinning Guidance out was somewhat like giving birth to a teenager. But what, as you saw it, were both the challenges and the opportunities for you suddenly running an independent medical device business? What could you do that you couldn't do as part of Lilly? What could you no longer do now that you didn't have Lilly behind you?
Well, first of all, let me say, we probably didn't see it as being as complex as it was, but if you think about where we were selling angioplasty and in a stent world still. We were selling someone else's pacemaker under our brand. So it was Medtronic's pacemaker, but we had them put our name on the can. Implantable defibrillators have never been shown to be better than best medical therapy at that time, and we were trying to sell a trocar that ended up being taken off in the market. So if you look at that portfolio, it's not what one would call really robust. So it's a good thing we weren't all that insightful. The thing it did allow us to do is to say, okay, now we're a publicly traded company, and we have got to make our earnings next quarter. the alignment we were able to get in the organization was far greater than anything we were able to get when we were part of Eli Lilly and Company. We passed out shares, stock, in pretty significant a way to the management. The complaint I had always gotten from our operating group is saying, when we talked about trying to leverage across the operation, they said we're not incented to do that. My boss is not incented to do that. So I said when we put the management committee together, that all of their compensation was going to be based on guidance success. It would have nothing to do with their individual operating unit success, and that 50% of their compensation would be in equity. And so they kind of sent a message. What we also did, and not too dissimilar to what we're doing with J&J now, said what are the 10 things that we need to really be good at as a company if we're going to be successful? And then we took our 60 vice presidents, we assigned each of them to one of those teams and said, listen, there are no ground rules here. It's a clean sheet of paper. You describe to us how we need to, what that organizational architecture needs to look like, and that's what we'll do. But you need to understand that you have to define how we're going to be most competitive. You're going to have to probably give up control to gain influence. Important concept. And so anyway, the vice presidents came back and they described how we're going to run the company.
What kind of control do they have to give up to get what kind of influence?
Well, what you end up with, on great companies, you're going to have a bunch of nodes and networks, all right? What we knew as an organization that there was huge value in the vertical organization, the silo, the business unit. And focus and accountability is the keystone to any level of success. At the same time, we said that's true and we're going to retain that, but we're also going to define horizontal mechanisms that will allow us to leverage across the company. We cannot have 6 payroll systems. We're going into a Clinton healthcare plan here, and in a situation where every health system in the world is under financial pressure, and so we're going to have to leverage not only our cost structure, but more importantly, leverage the capabilities of the firm. And so if we can't do that, then we're not going to be successful. So that ended up being an alignment that we could get in this process as a publicly traded company we couldn't get as a division of Eli Lilly and Company.
And it's interesting that you frame it in those terms, because I think a lot of people looking in retrospect at the success Guidance had assume that the company was off and running from the IPO, but Ginger Graham once said to me that there were a lot of people who thought that ACS and CPI were dead on arrival when we went public. So, internal organization aside, what from a technology point of view did you need to do to put both, specifically the vascular business, back on footing in the mid-1990s?
Well, first of all, let me say that we had to make sure that the implantable defibrillator thing continued to be robust, and the lead systems that went with that. And then on the vascular business, it was a process of getting into bare metal stents. The difference then versus, quote, now and the lag we've had in terms of drug-eluting stents, you didn't have a huge amount of business to lose. Mm-hmm. So your angioplasty business kind of stayed there, your guide wire business stayed there, and so then when people got visibility that you were going to be in bare metal stents, for instance, the market capitalization of the firm doubled the year before we got into the U.S. market, because people could see you were successful in Europe and that was going to happen in the U.S. When you came to the U.S. market in the fourth quarter of 97, you took 70 share points in 45 days. And people thought that was absolutely unheard of if you're the 4th or 5th player in the marketplace. So that's what was required. And then we were the only company that iterated on that. We came out with a new stent platform every year, and we essentially retained a 45% market share for 7 years.
You point out in passing that, in point of fact, you were the 4th or 5th into the marketplace. Why was that? What took you so long to recognize that there was an opportunity in bare metal stents?
Jeez.
How much time do we have?
How do you tell that story? An old mentor of mine that I learned a lot from, and obviously struggling with an illness right now, but he was convinced we were not going to put metal down people's coronary arteries. And so as Carl Simpson and I went down and talked to PAMAs and shots in a guy's rented office space. A guy named Romano. That which was an interesting case. I mean, the guy didn't have socks on. I'm thinking, I just came from California, and hell, at least we wear socks. We don't wear shoes, but we have socks on. Anyway, so went through that and said it looks like very interesting technology. But we decided at that point in time and it was kind of a reflection of the Shiley heart valve issue. Said we're not going to put metal down people's coronary arteries. So we decided not to do that program, and then kind of 2 or 3 years later said yes, we are, and went about it pretty aggressively, and were able to do the catch-up.
What turned it around for you? I mean, you did mention that Guidant alone had a new stent every year, and you talked before about 60% of sales coming from products introduced within the relatively short time frame before that. Was it simply product iteration? Because if you talk to the Johnson & Johnson folks like Bob Croce, they were kind of caught by surprise at how quickly Guidant took market share and took the market leadership.
Well, I think that's right. I think that but if they'd understood the interventional cardiology market and understood that those users will move based on the technology as well as the relationships, they shouldn't have been surprised. And I don't think then they were surprised this next go around when the same thing happened with drug-eluting stents.
Mm-hmm. I want to get to drug-eluting stents in 1 minute, but during this critical time when Guidant is really taking off, the stent business is really is booming. Between 1993 and 1998, virtually everybody else in cardiovascular devices is making a major acquisition in order to position itself. Johnson & Johnson buys Cordis, Boston buys Symed, AVE buys the USCI business of Bard, and then was itself acquired by Medtronic. Guidant alone did not do a major acquisition during that time and took some criticism for it. Why are you guys sitting on the sidelines? Were you really sitting on the sidelines? Did you look at those deals? Why didn't you participate in the Symed or the AVE sweepstakes, so to speak?
Well, if you think about it, that most all those transactions was trying to create what we already had. Boston Scientific bought Schneider because they had to access the agreements that we had done with the Yacht patents and the Bonzel patents. Okay? And so that was a very defensive, a couple of $1 billion defensive mode. If you think about Medtronic buying AVE for $4 billion, it was a defensive mode because Medtronic, my understanding, Medtronic was convinced that we would make so much money on the interventional business that we'd finance the electrophysiology business, and they wanted to try to interrupt that. So they were trying to get a position such as Guidant have. If you think about it, Guidant was uniquely positioned in both market leadership around interventional cardiology as well as in the electrophysiology piece. So one is, first of all, the first couple of years we were tainted. We couldn't use the stock, and we had no cash. So when you're if you don't have currency, it's tough to come to the market. And then later on, we did do the acquisition of Intermedics and
cardiac rhythm
management for the sole reason that in the last 15 years you have never seen more than 3 share points change based on a product offering in the Brady side of the business, unless you bought the distribution channel. So that's what we were about.
Let's get to cardiac rhythm management in just a second, because there's an obviously second piece to the stent market, which is drug-eluting stents. And I have enormous respect for you, but after missing the bare metal stent market, how could you miss the drug-eluting stent market too?
Yeah. You did. I guess what we would say is that it wasn't a lack of vision. And I say that in that if you think about what we were doing, whether it was ACS or Eli Lilly, back in the early 90s, there was a lot of kind of drug-eluting catheter work that was done, both on the design and as well as the animal work. If you think about what our activities were in stents, because we weren't going to put bare metal stents down coronary arteries, we were working all in bioabsorbable technology at that point in time, which was really for a drug delivery platform. And so as we take a step back and try to be critical ourselves and said, how could you miss this? Well, you didn't miss the idea, you missed the execution or the implementation, and then you come to say it's because you didn't put your best people or didn't put sufficient resources in place. And I would say that has to be true almost by definition, although we had it reporting to the most senior levels in the organization, which could have been part of the problem also. But and then it says, I begin to think about it, and really to J&J's credit, it's kind of like the first kid in school that learns to ride a unicycle, and then all the other kids learn to ride it. I don't think we were convinced that it actually could work. And then once you got convinced, yes, you can load drug on a stent in a coronary artery and impact restenosis, then things start to fall. You put the resources behind it, and things start to fall in line.
Now, we noted that Guidant didn't make a major acquisition, but it did try actually to buy Cook during this time.
Yes.
It didn't because of the license, because of the IP around the paclitaxel. Would Cook have been a major player, or was it simply a holding action until Guidant's old drug-eluting stent came to market?
Remember how this played out. First of all, we started with our own compound, actinomycin D, and it was a Merck compound, oncolytic, streptomyces derivative. Tried to go down a very quick path, and it didn't work clinically in Europe. So we got so far as we were in humans and saw some pretty disastrous restenosis rates. And then it said, but before we knew that, we said, we're going to be a year behind J&J, so we need to have a catch-up. So then we went to Cook and said, we will do this distribution for you around paclitaxel, which will give us a kind of we'll only be behind 6 to 9 months instead of a year and a half. And then, and thinking we had both of those in place, which we would call 2 shots on goal, then we were already negotiating with Novartis on everolimus to be kind of the third approach. Well, then, as you know, the actinomycin didn't work, and then the Cook transaction ended up being ruled illegal by the courts because they said that was a co-development agreement between Boston Scientific and Cook, and Guidant couldn't insert themselves in there the way they had or as extensively as they had. And we said, okay, we'll solve that by buying the parent Cook and put ourselves in their place. But that was predicated, a little different than what you had said, David, that was predicated on good clinical results in a predetermined differential manner, and they didn't happen. So now you've got actinomycin D fell out of bed, and then the Cook transaction, 2 legs of the Cook transaction fell out of bed, and then we completed a transaction with a biosensor to access their everolimus work to kind of give us a little bit of a head start. But I think part of all of, and then we went back and got an exclusive license to Novartis instead of a non-exclusive license. So what it says is you've got to be doing constant problem solving, trying to look forward and anticipate, and always have, if it's critical to the core of the business, always have multiple programs going on. And we went through obviously that and kind of where we are.
So let's talk a little about the CRM business and then wrap up. But Guidant is so identified, perhaps because of the ACS heritage, as an interventional cardiology company, but in fact CRM may be your biggest business and arguably your most promising. Give us a sense of how you see the vascular business, the CRM business coming together and creating a kind of coherent strategy for Guidant.
Well, I think it's a coherent strategy in terms of it is cardiovascular oriented. There's some sharing of technologies, but they are very different. They're different. Interesting because people talk about cultures. They are even different cultures within our company, and which is okay. That doesn't bother. We can't have different value systems, but we can have different cultures. We've got different cultures in manufacturing. We have product development. We have different cultures in Brussels, and we have in Indianapolis. So that's okay. And it says that again. Don't try to get too cute about melding the organization. There is a huge advantage, one more time, to this focus and accountability that comes to having a silo organization, of having a vertical organization. And then, yes, you look for the opportunities to leverage, but again, great companies are going to be about nodes and networks. And if you have dissipated this focus and accountability, and it will be the strongest challenge in the J&J transaction, the strongest management challenge, how do you make sure that stays there at the same time you're trying to take advantage of scale, which is something they obviously bring to the party. But they're both in great space, and in terms of the diseases they're trying to treat. Heart failure starts to maybe bring them a little closer in terms of numerous solutions. The customers are starting to overlap, interestingly, a little bit more than maybe even they did in the past.
In 1998, I was talking to Jay Graff, who was heading the CRM business at that time, and we were just beginning to hear talk about cardiac resynchronization therapy, CRT, as a promising opportunity. And Jay said to me, but I want to caution you, this isn't really stents. But in point of fact, CRT has exploded since then. Talk about the opportunity in CRT. And I know you've spent much of the last couple of years working with public policy folks in Washington with AdvaMed to kind of promote the importance of CRT therapy. What is CRT going to mean to Guidant and to J&J?
Well, if you think about heart failure is really the only cardiovascular disease that's increasing both in incidence and prevalence, and may be an outgrowth of the success we've had in some of the other technologies. And so it's got a huge patient population, and it's symptomatic versus sudden cardiac death. I mean, every individual knows whether they're their mom or dad or grandparents. I mean, because once you start describing the symptoms, people understand it. So I think that's one of the reasons you're going to be able to bring those patients in more readily. I would point out, and people could disagree with it, operationally what we did early on, we would not allow CRM to essentially say, we got this interesting therapy called resynchronization. We think it could be important, and we'd like for you to kind of eliminate the kind of operating ground rules of financing and have us kind of pursue this thing without being held accountable in terms of how the operating expenses are going to grow. So no, we're not going to do that. We'll go out and get external financing if you can, and we went through a lot of gyrations to try to do that. Did not work out, and then the operating unit said, okay, yes, we can fund it internally. Now, we may have lost 6 months or a year in terms of competitive advantage getting to the marketplace, but I think we had the chance to destroy the operating mentality of the group and the accountability of the group if we'd allowed that process to happen. So it's just a caution I would give that if you're going to do that, make sure that you segment off those decisions sufficiently so you don't taint the discipline that you build within the company.
Mm-hmm. Now, obviously, I noted that you've been working on policy issues for much of the last year. The other thing you've been working on for the last year is the Johnson & Johnson deal. Mm-hmm. From Guidant's perspective, what drives the deal? Is it shareholder value, or is there more to it than that?
Shareholder value is obviously there. I mean, we can look at all the multiples. I mean, 6.5 times sales and the multiple of EBITDA and EPS and the like. And so, that is a piece of it. Another piece of it is about the technology and how the technology is getting more complex, how it's getting integrated. And another piece is the market development piece. Think about what J&J did in terms of people knowing about bare metal stents or drug-eluting stents. I mean, hell, everybody in the developed world knows about those technologies. I think my mom knows about those technologies. And if they could do that for resynchronization therapy, instead of treating this 60,000 people, we're talking, orders of magnitude greater than that. And then the last piece is the health policy environment. I am very concerned about if we think even near term that the president's going to reduce and going to have a budget reconciliation, says we're going to go from 3.5% of GDP in terms of deficit down to 1.7 over the next 5 years. Two ways to do that. Either the denominator grows sufficiently in terms of the growth of the economy, or we've got to make some pretty significant cuts or changes in the spending. Where's that going to happen? It's not going to happen in Social Security. It's not going to happen in the war on terror. That thing is at kind of a knife edge to Medicare and Medicaid. And so we are going to be in a very difficult environment. And I think from a health policy standpoint, being part of a J&J organization will give greater stability of employment to our employees than any other situation.
When did the deal first become real, a discussion point? Some people point to the co-promotion deal that you did over Cipher as the kind of beginning of this collaboration that would lead inevitably to a marriage, but you're shaking your head no. Is that not where it came from?
We met in a little hotel up in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and I proposed the co-promotion agreement. They kind of proposed, what about something larger? And said, no, we're not interested in that. So, I mean, they have been interested, I would say, for 4 years plus, but in terms of any kind of fruitful type of discussions that really ended up being, I would say, more kind of July time frame than anything else.
Are you convinced that the combination of J&J and Guidant will create a better organization than both companies can be independently? I'm struck, I have to say, by what I see as the cultural differences between the two organizations. Guidant being more entrepreneurial, more resourceful, Johnson & Johnson more formal. putting the two together?
Well, and I think, and Johnson understands that. I think if one was to talk to Bill Weldon, he would say, this lack of ability to have this organic growth on this interventional side is very frustrating for them. The opportunity that happens around neuromodulation is very interesting to them, and so you've got to have this CRM piece. And he's saying that everybody tells me that Guidant is different in terms of this sense of urgency, the entrepreneurial. So essentially what he said is Guidant is going to be the construct. And not only is it going to be the name, we're going to organize ourselves in that approach. And so now what we're attempting to do now is to describe that. What's that mean in terms of incentive systems? What's that mean in terms of accountability? And quite honestly, it will not be as easy because you're not a freestanding publicly traded company, but that's a management challenge. And so if the management's up for it and if they're committed to that, they should be able to deliver that. If they can't, then it's going to be that old story written over again.
Guidant has always prided itself as an entrepreneurial culture, technologically savvy, fast development times. As you get to be a company that is the size of a $25 billion valuation, do you think that's still true of Guidant? Do you think that kind of vision is still sustainable, or does that kind of culture go away as you get to be a certain size?
You've got to manage it. I mean, I can tell you that I got frustrated a couple of years ago that I thought we'd lost a portion of our competitiveness, which is, there's a lot of things that look like competitiveness. Let me give you an example of that. Medtronic and Boston Scientific were in negotiations and arbitration around their rapid exchange products, and so then the question is, the street said, well, whoever loses it's going to license the other guy. I said, no. We have personalities involved here, okay? There's not necessarily a licensing going to take place. So as I asked the management committee, I said, what will we do when this jump ball happens? How do we take advantage of one of those people coming out of the marketplace? And the response was we had sufficient inventory. That's not quite a strategy, okay? So it said we need to make sure that we've got a level of competitiveness in the firm that says any time that you're going to put 10 share points, 15 share points up for grab, that we have, that we're the kind of organization that drools over something like that. So we've worked very hard in the last couple of years to say, let's make sure that competitiveness is still there and that we pursue those kind of opportunities, and I'm convinced today it is.
Ron, this has been outstanding, and we could talk for hours more. Let me end by asking you this. You are now getting ready to exit the stage as Guidant CEO and handing your baby over to your teenager, right, over to another organization. How do you think Ron Dollens will be remembered in years to come? What do you think your legacy will be for the medical device space, given that Guidant was an extraordinary success in the 10 years that it was a public entity?
David, I don't have a clue. When we celebrated the 10th year, and I just happened to re-look, I hadn't seen that little video that we put together, and I watched it this weekend, but there were a couple of pieces that through that we said it is all about the people, because there is no technology, there are no processes. I mean, they all reside in the intellectual capital, the human capital, and so it is all about the people. But the thing that I found interesting, and at least I felt compelled to make the remarks to say it's not just the people that started with us. It's not just the people that ended with us. I say ended, that's probably wrong. But we have had a lot of people come through this organization that were hugely talented, made a significant commitment to us, and went on to do important things. Those are also a significant part of who we have become. I would like for that larger community to say the work I did there was important. I left that organization, if they left it, a better person in terms of more capable person, and anything the Dollens had to do with that, then I'm appreciative of.
Well,
and
I have to say I've known you for 10 years, and it's been a delight to have you for the last 45 minutes and an honor to know you for the previous 10 years. Thank you very much.
Okay.